Alright, let's go. Number 10. The cart that counted its own miles. Around 25 BC, the Roman architect and engineer Vitruvius sat down to write De Architectura, a 10-book manual covering everything from city planning to the design of siege engines. And buried in Book 10 is a device most history books skip straight past. A cartwheel rigged to count the distance it travels, on its own, with no one watching it and no one doing the math. The mechanism is almost embarrassingly elegant. A cartwheel 4 Roman feet across turns exactly 400 times over the course of 1 Roman mile. Vitruvius geared that wheel into a train with a ratio of 400 to 1, so that after those 400 revolutions, a single small gear completes precisely 1 full turn. That gear carries a peg, and the peg knocks 1 pebble out of a hopper and drops it into a collecting box below. Walk the mile, hear the click, and somewhere under the cart, a stone has already fallen to keep count for you. Some historians even push the idea further back, to Archimedes, since the same drop-a-pebble trick and the worm gear mechanics behind it show up in other devices attributed to him a few generations earlier. Most modern accounts of the odometer start the story in the coach and carriage age of early modern Europe, centuries after Rome had already fallen, gearing this idea as a product of Enlightenment clockwork ingenuity. Vitruvius describes a working version of it doing the same job, with the same core ratio and drop logic, some 1700 years earlier, mounted to a cartwheel rolling down a Roman road. Nobody needed a live person crouched under the axle counting turns. The gear did the counting and the pebble did the reporting, silently, mile after mile, on roads built to carry legions and grain, using a piece of engineering logic that would not need to be reinvented so much as simply remembered. Number 9. The calendar that filled a 500-year silence. In 1983, 4 small corroded fragments of a geared brass instrument surfaced on the antiquities market and were acquired by the Science Museum in London. Nobody knew quite what they were looking at until conservators began reconstructing the gear train, and the shape that emerged was a portable sundial fused to a mechanical calendar, built sometime around the reign of the Byzantine Emperor Justinian I in the 6th century AD. Turn the dial, and the device tracks the moon's shifting phase and age in days, and likely once showed the relative positions of the sun and moon against the zodiac, all through a nest of hand-cut bronze gears small enough to carry in 1 palm. That alone would be a curiosity. What makes it something else is the gap it sits inside. The only other known geared astronomical device from the ancient world is the Antikythera mechanism, built roughly 700 years earlier and pulled from a Greek shipwreck in 1901. For most of the 20th century, historians treated that machine as an isolated miracle, a one-off feat of Hellenistic engineering with no children and no ancestors, gearing sophisticated enough that nothing comparable was assumed to exist again, until Islamic astronomers and, later, European clockmakers picked the idea back up centuries afterward. This small Byzantine sundial breaks that assumption apart. It sits almost exactly in the middle of the silence, proof that someone, somewhere in the Eastern Roman world, was still hand-cutting calendar gears in the tradition of the Antikythera builders 7 centuries after that shipwreck went down, quietly keeping a mechanical skill alive through an age we generally describe as having lost it. The tradition did not vanish and get rediscovered. It just went underground for a while, small enough to fit in someone's hand, and surfaced again in 1983 to prove it had never actually stopped. Number 8. The instrument that measured a straight line to the horizon. Sometime in the 1st century AD, the engineer Hero of Alexandria wrote a treatise called Dioptra, describing an instrument built to solve a problem every large construction project runs into. How do you draw an accurate straight line, or a true right angle, across a landscape you cannot see all of at once? His answer was a stand-mounted device with 2 metal plates, one set flat and one set vertical, each calibrated with angle markings, turned by a worm gear drive fine enough for precise adjustment, leveled with water, and sighted, along with a rotating bar that functioned as an early alidade. Point it at a target, read the angle off the plate, tilt the vertical plate to measure elevation, and you have, in 1st century Alexandria, the working core of a theodolite, an instrument that reads horizontal and vertical angles at once. Roman surveyors, the agrimensors, adapted the design to lay out roads, aqueducts, and property boundaries across an empire that eventually stretched from Britain to the edge of Persia, projects that demanded angular accuracy over distances of many kilometers. The theodolite, as most textbooks introduce it, is a story that begins in 16th century Europe, with instrument makers refining brass sighting devices for the new science of cartography. Hero's Dioptra was already doing the essential job 1,500 years before that, reading the exact angle to the exact horizon on a construction site where a mistake of a few degrees could mean an aqueduct that simply did not reach the city it was built for. Number 7. The water pressure that learned to play music. In Alexandria, sometime around 270 to 246 BC, the engineer Ctesibius built an instrument that had no precedent anywhere, a keyboard. 24 keys, each one opening a valve to a bronze pipe tuned to its own note, spanning 2 full octaves, played by hand the way a modern organ is played. The device was called the Hydraulis, and its real innovation was not the keys. It was the water. Air alone, pumped by hand or foot, comes out in surges, loud and soft, uneven with every stroke of the bellows. Ctesibius solved that by forcing the air into a chamber partly submerged in a cistern of water. The water pushes back against the air with a steady, unchanging counter-pressure, so no matter how unevenly a person works the pump, the air reaching the pipe stays smooth and constant. It is a pressure regulator built entirely from water and physics, centuries before anyone had a word for hydraulics as a field of study, and it is the reason the Hydraulis could hold a clean, sustained tone instead of the wheeze of a leather bag. The Romans loved it. Hydraulis players performed at gladiatorial games and imperial banquets, and the instrument spread across the empire as a genuine popular entertainment, not a curiosity locked in a scholar's workshop. Most accounts of the pipe organ open the story in the medieval churches of Europe, with monks and instrument builders credited for creating the first true keyboard instrument out of whole cloth thin air. Ctesibius built a working keyboard 1,500 years earlier in a city on the Egyptian coast, and it was popular enough that Roman coins were struck with its image. Number 6. The jar that heard the earthquake nobody felt. In 132 AD, the Han Dynasty scholar Zhang presented the Chinese imperial court with a bronze vessel roughly 2 meters across, ringed on the outside with 8 dragon heads facing the 8 compass directions, each dragon holding a small bronze ball in its jaws. Beneath each dragon crouched a bronze toad, mouth open, waiting. Inside the vessel, hidden from view, sat a mechanism sensitive enough to respond to the faintest tremor traveling through the ground. When an earthquake struck, even one too distant and too gentle to be felt in the capital, the internal mechanism tipped just enough in the direction of the shockwave to release exactly 1 ball from exactly 1 dragon into the mouth of the toad below. Whichever direction that dragon faced was the direction the earthquake had come from. Officials at court reportedly doubted the device the first time it triggered, with no shaking felt at all, until a messenger arrived days later, having ridden hundreds of miles, confirming a quake had struck a province in the direction the dragon had pointed. That is not a folk legend dressed up as science. It is a working directional seismoscope, functioning on principles of inertia that would not be formally described in the West for another 17 centuries. Most surveys of seismology open with the 1880s, when the British scientist John Milne began building the instruments that seismologists still credit as the beginning of the field. Zhang Heng's bronze jar was already telling the Han court which direction the ground had moved, 1,700 years before anyone in Europe thought to try. Number 5. The flute that played whatever song you gave it. In 9th century Baghdad, inside the House of Wisdom, 3 brothers known as the Banu Musa compiled a book of 100 mechanical devices called the Kitab al-Hiyal, the Book of Ingenious Devices, published around 850 AD. Buried among trick pitchers and automatic fountains is a machine that does something none of the others do. It plays music, and it can be reprogrammed to play a different piece. The device used steam-driven air pressure to force wind through a flute, the same basic idea Ctesibius had explored over 1,000 years earlier, with water instead of steam. What made the Banu Musa's machine different was a rotating cylinder, studded with pins, arranged in a specific pattern that dictated exactly which notes played and in what rhythm. Swap the cylinder for one with a different pin pattern, and the same machine plays an entirely different tune. That is not just automation. That is programmability, separating the machine that performs an action from the instructions, telling it what action to perform, stored physically and swapped out at will. The idea of the programmable machine is usually taught starting with the Jacquard loom in 1804, threading punched cards to control woven patterns, treated as the conceptual ancestor of computer programming itself. The Banu Musa brothers built a working version of that same core idea, an interchangeable set of physical instructions controlling a machine's output 950 years earlier, and used it to make a flute that could learn a new song simply by handing it a new cylinder. Number 4. The toy that spun on steam and never went to work. In the 1st century AD, Hero of Alexandria described more than 70 mechanical devices in a text called Pneumatica, and one of them has become the single most repeated fact about ancient engineering, the Aeolipile. A hollow sphere, mounted so it could spin freely, connected by tubes to a water-filled vessel below. Heat the water, and steam rises into the sphere. That steam escapes through two bent nozzles pointed sideways, and the reaction pushes the sphere into a fast, steady spin. That is not a toy trick of physics. That is the working principle behind every steam turbine, and, indirectly, every jet engine built since. Pressurized gas escaping through directed nozzles, converting expansion into rotation. Hero had it running on a tabletop in Roman Egypt, roughly 1700 years before Thomas Savery patented the first commercial steam engine in England in 1698. Here is the part that stings more than the date. Hero never scaled it up. Nobody in the Roman world hitched the Aeolipile to a pump, a mill, or a loom. It stayed a demonstration piece, a curiosity for lecture halls, spinning in front of an audience and then getting put back on the shelf. The likeliest reason has nothing to do with engineering. Rome ran much of its economy on slave labor, and there was no economic pressure pushing anyone to mechanize work that unpaid hands were already doing. The physics of the steam engine did not have to wait 17 centuries to be discovered. It had already been discovered and demonstrated and understood well enough to describe in writing. What it waited 17 centuries for was a reason. Number 3. The mill on a dead man's tombstone. In the ancient city of Hierapolis, in what is now southwestern Turkey, a Roman-era miller named Marcus Aurelius Ammianus was buried sometime in the second half of the 3rd century AD beneath a stone sarcophagus carved with a relief of the machine that had made his living. It shows a water wheel fed by a channel of running water, driving a gear train connected to two frame saws, and the mechanism linking that rotating wheel to the up and down stroke of the saw blades is unmistakable to anyone who has looked inside an engine, a crank, joined to a connecting rod. That single carved image rewired the history of mechanical engineering. A crank paired with a connecting rod converts circular motion into straight-line reciprocating motion, and back again, and that conversion sits at the heart of nearly every piston-driven machine built since, including the steam engine industrialization was supposedly waiting on. Before this relief was properly studied, historians dated the invention of the crank and connecting rod mechanism to roughly 1,000 years later in the medieval period. Ammianus's tombstone pushed it back a full millennium in one discovery, on a monument that was never meant to be an engineering record. It was meant to tell visitors what kind of man was buried there. He ran a sawmill, and the machine running it already contained, in working form, the exact motion that a car engine still performs today, every time a piston fires. Number 2. The tower that learned to tick. In 725 AD, the Buddhist monk Yi Jing and the government official Liang Lingzan built a water-powered armillary sphere for the Chinese imperial court and equipped it with a mechanism that let it move in small, regular, controlled steps rather than a smooth, continuous drift, the earliest known form of a clock escapement. More than 3.5 centuries later, in 1092, the Song dynasty official Su Song took that same principle and built something no one had attempted before, an entire clock tower in Kaifeng, driven by the escapement and connected to the world's oldest known chain drive, a mechanism Su Song called the Celestial Ladder. The tower stood roughly 10 meters tall. Water wheels drove the escapement. The escapement released motion in even, ticking steps, and those steps turned an armillary sphere for astronomical observation on the upper level, while, on the lower levels, 133 mechanical figures emerged on schedule to ring bells, strike gongs, and beat drums, marking the hours for the entire city below. Su Song wrote the whole design down in a technical treatise the same year the tower was completed. An escapement is the part of a mechanical clock that turns steady rotational force into a regular tick, the exact component that lets any clock keep time rather than simply spin. Most timelines of the mechanical clock begin in 14th century European monasteries, treating the escapement as a medieval European breakthrough. The tick had already been running for over 200 years by then, ringing bells over a Chinese city from a tower nobody in Europe had heard of. Number 1. The wheel that learned to push and pull at once. In 1206, the engineer Ismail al-Jazari, working at the court in Diyarbakir, completed the Book of Knowledge of Ingenious Mechanical Devices, 50 machines documented in exacting technical drawings. Among them is a twin-cylinder water pump, built around a single rotating wheel, fitted with more than one crank pin, each pin driving a connecting rod that pushes and pulls a piston in a straight line as the wheel spins. That is a crankshaft, not just one crank doing one job, but a shaft engineered to convert rotary motion into multiple simultaneous reciprocating strokes, the exact configuration sitting inside every car engine, every bicycle you pedal, every reciprocating pump built since. The idea did not appear from nothing. 9 centuries earlier, a Roman miller in Hierapolis had a single crank and connecting rod carved onto his own tombstone, driving one saw with one motion. The Banu Musa brothers used cranks in their own hydraulic devices in 9th century Baghdad. Al-Jazari's contribution was pulling that lineage into its final recognizable form. A wheel doing the work of a crankshaft, engineered on purpose, described in enough technical detail that modern historians of engineering call it the direct conceptual ancestor of the mechanism still spinning, right now, inside a moving car. Trace the line all the way back, and it does not end with a single genius in a workshop. It runs from a dead miller's gravestone in Roman Anatolia, through Baghdad's House of Wisdom, to a court engineer in a city on the Tigris, each one adding a piece to a mechanism none of them could have known would still be turning, essentially unchanged, 800 years later, every time someone turns a key. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.